Some manufacturers store more data than others, but it can typically revolve around the trim level of the vehicle and the age of the vehicle. So we may see a spike where there's a lot of data on some vehicles of a certain age, and then their next platform or next iteration of vehicles, it starts to dip a little bit, and then another one might shoot up, showing us more data types. It's important that we triage each vehicle before commencing work on it, because there are so many different trim levels of vehicles, ages of vehicles that are on our roads, and they all have got different components on them, and they all have different data types that can be given up. So we need to narrow down whether or not it's a proportionate line of inquiry depending on the vehicle and the systems that are on there, and the tools and the solutions that we've got to extract the data to make sure it's a proportionate line of inquiry. Currently, there is no regulation in Europe or the UK for manufacturers to store crash data on vehicles. Whilst some of them do make it available for investigation, and it is due to be mandatory on all new vehicles going forward, there are still a lot of vehicles out there that potentially have airbag control modules that deploy the safety restraint systems but don't actually record that data. In those instances, we would look to some of the other ECUs and start to look at the vehicle holistically, because some of the other ECUs, such as an engine ECU, can also be monitoring the vehicle systems, particularly the vehicle speed. And when a fault occurs during the crash, such as a loss of electrical circuit somewhere, then it can create what we call a snapshot and a fault at that time that we would term as freeze frame data, and we see a snapshot of the vehicle's speed at the time the fault was recorded. Great care needs to be taken over the interpretation of these snapshot speeds that we see on some of these ECUs, but we have done a lot of research and validation around these types of speeds that we see in freeze frame data to know that they are fairly accurate with regards to knowing a speed at the time the vehicle was involved in a crash and a fault occurred on the system. In a crash situation, we would be looking at the airbag control module. Sometimes they can be capturing what was going on in the lead up to a crash before the airbags have been deployed or the safety restraint systems, and we can capture in the main generally 5 seconds worth of data in that lead up to see what the braking input was like, the steering input was like, the speed of the vehicle, and some of the advanced driver assistance systems as to whether or not they were in place, such as stability control, etc. And that can help build a picture as to regards whether or not the vehicle was braking as the drivers reported, whether or not they have been paying attention in regards to the unfolding events before the collision's taken place. Okay, when we get into some of the advanced techniques that we use in order to acquire some of this data, then we have to sometimes remove chips from circuit boards, and that we would term a destructive process, because we're having to heat the chip up to remove it from the circuit board, and then we're having to read it with other specialist equipment whilst it's off the circuit board. We would tend to class that as a destructive process, because albeit we can resolder the chip back to the circuit board, it's not done to a manufacturing standard. So it's important to recognise that the data can still be obtained, but it may mean that we have to perform some level of destruction with the unit in order to read it. If we've got a damaged vehicle that's either burnt out or it's been submerged in water, then there are still options to recover data from those vehicles. And often investigators can dismiss these as a viable line of inquiry because the vehicles say networks aren't in communication, and some of the tools that we would ordinarily use we can't use because of the damaged state of the components. However, we have managed to recover data by going direct to those artifacts that sometimes can remain intact despite a fire. Some of them are well protected by dash areas and can be moulded around in the heat from, say, some of the plastic, or if something has been submerged in water, then we can look at ways in which that can be preserved, dried out, and then carefully examined as to whether or not we can still directly read the chips and storage mediums that are inside some of these components to then be able to reconstruct the data from the ground up. When we get down to reading some of the chips and the file systems that are on some of the systems that are on a vehicle, it can be really difficult to decode that information. We've got to remember that it's proprietary to the manufacturers and to the tier 1 providers within the automotive industry, but sometimes we can reach out to those tier 1 providers, and we have established relationships with some of the main players within the automotive industry whereby they will assist us, and that can involve sending modules abroad for them to read the data and provide us back with an interim report of their findings. When we're carrying out a HELIX examination, it's important that we document the processes that we're undertaking, and that's starting really at the initial triage and strategy to set the platform for what then goes on to be an examination. When we're at the vehicle, we're making records with regards to what we've done, how we've done it, and at what times we've interacted with it, in order to make sure that we've got a robust evidential product that's fit for court purposes further down the line, so that people can see and we can be transparent over the techniques and solutions that we've used, and that somebody could repeat that process if they needed to show that the examination had been conducted appropriately. Electric vehicles are problematic to a degree, and that's just because of the safe handling of them, particularly those that have been involved in serious collisions. They are at risk of being a real safety hazard to examiners of those vehicles, and it's always important to ensure that you've got somebody that has got some training around high voltage systems because of the dangers that they pose. You need to be able to make sure that how the vehicle has been handled prior to getting to it, the appropriate measures have been taken before you put hands on the vehicle.